celebrate scholarly work that Rebecca Fanning has completed as a component of her time here at the College of Charleston in the Environmental Studies Master's Program. The event today will include Rebecca's presentation. Then we will have an open public question and answer after the presentation. And then we'll have a closed door session with just the committee for additional questions. So I'm pleased to introduce the committee, which includes Sharleen Johnson from South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, Tim Callahan from the Department of Geology, and Joshua Robinson from Robinson Design Engineers. And at this point, I'm going to say that it has been an absolute pleasure working with Rebecca and getting to know her in plant ecology and through this process. But for the formal introduction, I'm passing the mic to Joshua Robinson.
Thank you, Courtney. Can you hear me okay? Okay. As you all know, this presentation culminates Rebecca's graduate internship project, which is the capstone of the Masters of Science in Environmental and Sustainability Studies degree. She is weeks away from completing this course of study and also that for the master's degree in public administration. And this unique interdisciplinary dual degree program is demanding and requires students to explore the complex environmental issues from the perspectives of both science and policy. So today is a big day as Rebecca nears the end of this nearly 3-year journey. In 2011, Rebecca earned a BA degree in Russian language and literature from Bard College in the Hudson Valley of New York. She then lived and worked in New York and in the Bay Area of California for several years before returning to her native Charleston, where she began the dual degree program here at the college in 2017. Among Rebecca's many interests are birding, gardening, and beekeeping. And she has led a variety of workshops and volunteer programs ranging from beach cleanups along the California coast to the student garden locally at the Stone Oak Preserve. Rebecca's interest and hands-on know-how are what led us to invite her to join Robinson Design Engineers as a summer intern in 2019 to help us explore ways we might restore small streams by hand, avoiding the need for crude and costly diesel-powered machinery. Within a month of beginning her internship last summer, she asked if she could expand the summer job into a full-blown master's thesis project. And in the last 18 months, she has persevered through grueling fieldwork, floods, and pestilence. And it is not an exaggeration to say that her discoveries and insights have altered the way we think about watersheds and our role in restoring them. So now, legacies and trajectories to inform restoration of southeastern Piedmont streams. Rebecca, the Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you, Joshua. And it's true, this has been an entirely unforgettable year. And I have at least one camp story that I'll be telling for the rest of my life. But that's for another time. This really started in a wetlands and watersheds class with Tim Callahan and Joshua Robinson, where I entered as a Russian studies person and left as a hydrologist. And a couple of years later, spring 2019, that's when the internship of Robinson Design Engineers began. Feels like a different era, but I remember it well. I got invited, as Joshua said, to explore hand-built methods for stream restoration using wood instead of heavy machinery. And that started to make a lot of sense when I saw their recent installation, or relatively recent then, of engineered woody jams at Givens Estates outside of Asheville. And when you walk that property, you start to get it, why log jams. It's narrow, it's deep in there. There's a building, actually, perhaps you can see it behind the trees. And these engineered woody jams are passively rebuilding a channel that was too deep. They slow the flow of water, the sediment slows down and has a chance to drop out, rebuilding that bed and connecting the waterway to its riparian corridor, which has now been allowed to encroach onto the lawn. This was an interesting moment because we were testing out a rapid assessment monitoring tool, the Large Woody Debris Index, that seeks to show the geomorphic function of wood in streams. And that's because we were about to scale up these engineered woody jams on a property south of Gaffney, South Carolina, Minkum Creek and its watershed. You can see that it's traced by logging roads and about 5 miles of tributaries, including Minkum Creek. Minkum Creek flows down into Thickety and finally to the Broad River, which is cloudy with sediment. And my first explorations of this site were with Nolan Williams, environmental hydrologist at RDE. We were leapfrogging. He was surveying the streams with depth measurements. I was documenting large woody debris pieces and natural debris pileups. And as I wandered this property, I started to get a little perplexed. You would walk up a tributary and everything looked normal until you hit a head cut. And it was like being out west. There's a trickle of water at your feet and this canyon seeming gully, some of them 20 feet high. Gully, which Joshua Robinson says that these streams are way jacked up, which I understand from Phil Ellis is something brought from the Citadel. If you can tell, excuse me, I'm working on 2 screens and I forgot to keep the right one up to date. So jacked up streams, canyon gullies, and if you can see, there's Chris Gross on the banks. He's about 20 feet above the heads of the others. And the trails are equally incised. What were we to do? Well, fortunately for us, there was a national park nearby in the same basin, as a matter of fact, and in the same eco-region level 4 Kings Mountain terrain of the Piedmont as Minkum Creek. This is Kings Mountain National Military Park, and a quick desktop analysis showed that it had similar valley characteristics, slope, similar underlying geology, similar soil types, especially these 2 sub-watersheds here with the red dots. Those are the areas that we surveyed to understand what Minkum could be. When we visited the site, it had verdant riparian corridors and clear running streams. And what I discovered as Robinson design engineers were doing their comparative analysis of stream morphometrics was what happened to Minkum happened to Kings too. There were 6 cubic miles of soil that went missing in the southeastern Piedmont region, north or inland of the fall line and stretching from Virginia to Alabama. 6 cubic miles of soil. That's a mountain. And this is what Kings Mountain looked like in the 1930s. It was bought using federal emergency conservation work funding and turned into a national and state park. The Civilian Conservation Corps went around installing these erosion control treatments. Some of them are still visible in evidence today, and planting thousands of trees where the land had been deforested. And you wouldn't know. We've forgotten what happened to our landscape. It is gorgeous there now, and you can visit it any time of year. But this was Kings Mountain then. And this is Minkum Creek now. If this is Kings Mountain now, then what could Minkum become? Today, I'm going to go over some concepts of stream restoration, especially in light of conditions in the southeastern Piedmont, and stream evolution, or how streams adapt to legacy mutations imposed on them from, let's say, environmental contexts. In the section on legacies, I'll go over forgotten legacy effects of accelerated erosion during the Cotton era in the southeastern Piedmont generally, and then specifically at Minkum Creek and its vicinity. On trajectories, I will use RD's baseline analysis to show how riparian vegetation has been affected by changes in the hydrologic order of streams and floodplains. And then I'll go over some of my findings in the critical analysis of the Large Woody Debris Index, which is that rapid monitoring tool that's gaining use in the Carolinas to document in-stream wood storage and its geomorphic function. In conclusion, I will muse on the lessons of the oldest inhabitant, the generational amnesia affecting us as we forget the legacies of erosion in the southeastern Piedmont, and talk about what that means for stream restoration and the course correction we can achieve today. So without further ado, stream restoration. Robinson Design Engineers have taken this quote by Wendell Berry as a kind of Hippocratic oath for restoration activities that they involve themselves with. And it reads, "We have never known what we were doing because we have never known what we were undoing." South Carolina, by the way, has one of the longest records of anthropogenic hydromodification, either direct or indirect. And stream restoration has the capacity to be listed under a future heading of legacy effects of hydromodification in the Southeast. We have to understand what has been undone, legacies. Then we cannot know what we are doing until we know what nature would be doing if we were doing nothing. This describes natural resilience, self-renewing systems, and the trajectories that could be achieved with course correction. From a regulatory standpoint, the Clean Water Act is what governs stream restoration activities, and the stated objective, the first words really of the whole section, is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Integrity is used in stream restoration literature just everywhere, and it's lost its meaning, and no one really tries to adequately define it. So I will, and I think you'll get it. Integrity of natural systems means that it's unperturbed, it's natural, it's wild, it's pristine, it has pristinity. And there's this other side of integrity, which is that its systems are intact. Not only is it a pristine environment in its form, but it has intact processes at play. But if we're being honest with ourselves, there's probably not a square inch left on this earth that is entirely pristine or completely intact. The opposite has occurred. We have corrupted the pristine environment, and we have broken processes. So moving from a place of impairment to one of restoration, taking broken systems and corrupted forms and bringing them towards pristinity and towards intact systems has led to two schools of thought. There are form-based restorationists, and this approach is probably most easily understood in the context of an urban environment, for example, where pristine or a natural look is desirable, but intact processes would probably not be acceptable. This Confluence Park in Denver, Colorado doesn't have a proper floodplain. It has a sidewalk terrace. But the other school of thought, and this is perhaps most applicable to Minkum Creek, is process-based restoration, where you're really not too concerned about how it looks, the pristinity. You sort of trust that by prioritizing intact systems, you'll have a self-renewing capacity that leads towards a more pristine or more natural environment. And you can see that from this low-tech process-based restoration manual, which came out a year or two ago. Rule number 1 is it's okay to be messy. They have been reintroducing beaver to the landscape, mimicking their dams, and it sort of reminds me of tire tracks in the Francis Marion or something. It doesn't fit that look of what we think of with beautiful winding single-threaded sinuous streams, but it's working. So what are we going to do? Well, we have incised streams to be restored. We can intervene with engineered woody jams, and this can have the effect of bringing the the connection between groundwater and surface water back into the root zones of shallow rooting plants and bringing those floodplains back to a place towards pristinity and towards systems that are intact. The other effect that it has is that it allows this channel to occasionally, from time to time, activate its floodplains, spill over its banks. At this deep of a level of incision, it is very unlikely that this water will ever bring the requisite nutrients, seeds, or water to surface roots of short-rooted plants. So, next, stream evolution. How do streams self-adjust in the face of disturbance, natural, and disruption, anthropogenic? Here you see on the left, Minkum Creek, its main branch running clear. On the right, a turbid tributary is polluting downstream waters, corrupting them, impairing them. If you were to walk upstream on Minkum's main branch, you would find some sort of genetic material that makes this system work. And that is that it has shallow bedrock seams that have been exposed, halting erosion. These channels do not cut down. They have been maintained, connected to their floodplain because of this natural context that they have available to them. However, on the right side, if you walk up that tributary, you'll see a kind of meritocracy at work. This stream is having to survive, it's having to adapt. It has been oversteepened due to excess erosion over the years, too much stream power, too much water flowing through it. It's trying to cut a meander to relax that longitudinal slope, and it's taking mud with it. You can see slumped material here. This bank is failing. You can see riparian vegetation has not yet had the chance to colonize this far. The temptation here is to freeze that stream in place with robust quantities of rock, which require heavy equipment and diesel fuel. And this image, the cross veins you see here, come from the National Engineering Handbook on Stream Restoration and describe Rosgen's approach using boulders, which may make sense in Colorado. But in the southeastern Piedmont, at Minkum Creek in particular, we're missing something. If we just think about rock and water, we're missing that tripod of geomorphic integrity, wood, alive and fallen. And this is perhaps even more so in the case where beds and banks are degrading, because this is what nature would do if we were doing nothing. It would you would see an influx of wood into that stream. It would obstruct the flow, and it would start this process of adaptation to degradation, which Coué and Thorne have modeled neatly here for us in a cyclical fashion. You see, if you were to say, be at a stage 1 and ignore stage 0 for now, and something got broken, something got corrupted, you were deforested, and you lost 7.6 inches of soil from every acre of your forest or former forest, and you lost 7.6 inches of water holding capacity on your land, then you would see an increase in the amount of water flowing through these valley bottoms, and that would lead to channel incision at stage 3, or degradation of the beds. And that channel incision could, over time, cause rapid widening to occur, an influx of sediment as the banks collapse, and note that the trees fall in as well, obstructing that stream flow. And as the longitudinal slope relaxes, you see that a little floodplain is being built inset within its former floodplain, now terraced high above forest floor. And this is the aim of most regulatory objectives in South Carolina. We want to see quasi-equilibrium where there's no lateral activity, there's no adjustment, it's reached a stable state. And this sort of mimics stage 1. There's a sinuous single-threaded stream inset there within the former channel banks, and a new riparian zone there in the terraces. However, if we allow the stream to self-adjust, and we trust that with intact systems, it will mimic a natural and more pristine form, then we might see lateral activity, we might see floodplain activation, we might see a new channel form on the other side. and all the things that come with natural disturbance, which is adaptations. Anastomosing wet woodland complexes. This is set as the precursor stage because there's one environmental engineer in our world who used to progress streams along a course towards anastomosing quite effectively, and that was the American beaver, Castor canadensis. If you see here, this is from a manual that comes from out west. They're reintroducing beaver, as I said. They're installing beaver dam analogs. Excuse me. And an incised stream at stage 3 can, over time, recover and adapt and survive and become highly laterally active. This floodplain is intimately connected with the waterways, and so is the water table. It's now back at the surface instead of deeply buried in the subsoil and available to short-rooted plants. Joshua Robinson taught me the definition of resilience, and I believe it. He says that resilience is the flexible capacity to adapt, recover, and be made stronger by disturbance. And this happens when we have positive feedback loops for integrity-driven restoration, systems that are intact and working together. Legacies in the Piedmont are a little astonishing. When I first saw pictures of Providence Canyon, I was terrified. I thought, this is where Minkum is headed. This is going to happen to Minkum. It is going to have an erosion monolith on its upland. And when I visited Providence Canyon and saw what the streams look like, I felt even more assured because this was all too familiar a sight to me, having walked around Minkum. I read all about it, and I learned that we're safe. Providence Canyon is below the fall line, and part of the reason why it had such cavernous and insane erosion 200 feet down was because of calcium deposits under the subsoil. And this is where I'm at the edge of my understanding, and take what I say next as a grain of salt. But if you've ever heard of sinkholes, it's something like that happened. And this could be the trajectory that we're on the coastal side of the fall line. But to get back to legacies in the southeastern Piedmont, you've seen this image before. Trimble documented average depth of soil erosion across the entire southeastern Piedmont. And I started to learn how this happened. This wild place, this whole region was violent for a long time. But by about 1800, the French Indian War and the American Revolution were far enough in the rear view that people started to feel comfortable settling inland. Americans were free to float logs to mill dams for sawing, eventually crisscrossing the forests with railroads to make it easier to slice into those forests. And landowners brought the enslaved with them and planted cotton and corn. They started in the black soiled valley bottoms, but then those got buried between 4 and 15 feet deep, according to some estimates, in worthless sand and clay, worthless to plants anyway. The subsoils that were washed down from the deforested uplands filled in the valley bottoms and buried them, buried the loam of the floodplains, the silt, the fertile deposits that had been establishing for forever. This affected a rise in the water table, creating back swamps, and you see outbreaks of malaria increase in the southeastern Piedmont. And also, there were drainage laws enacted. They thought that, states thought that these drainage laws would be applied in coastal environments to drain wetlands for agricultural use, but to their chagrin, it was almost exclusively applied in the Piedmont region to drain these valley bottoms to try and restore the soils that were buried underneath. Oak hickory forest was removed, and shortleaf pine grew up wherever it had been taken away as sort of an indicator species. The landscape was broken. They use this word over and over again in the historical narratives and the newspapers. And they use it in two ways. They refer both to the taming of the land by plow, breaking the land, as well as the effect that that had in forming gashes and hillsides. These landscapes, these hillsides were broken, as you can see here. The Southerners called their ground sugar soils. They dissolved in rain. And in some areas, historical accounts tell of storms that would crumble acres of land at a time, taking churches, houses, barns with them. In the late 1800s, in part thanks to the boll weevil and also thanks to the expense of commercial fertilizers for feeding worn out lands, not to mention the new freedom of the once enslaved to flee for their lives, agricultural exploits decline in the early 20th century, but the erosion doesn't until the 1920s. There were some forests apparently that were ready to be harvested again. So now the landscape is left to cyclically and deforest to this day. But missing from every forest floor, inches to over a foot of topsoil washed away. And missing too, and over 100 years ago, those virgin timber stands are long gone. I found out that buffalo ostensibly roamed all the way to Charleston, and that beaver had every stream running in rivulets through grassy wetland forest complexes. And 18th century accounts confirm this. They say that Piedmont Streams ran clear even in flood. Even when they were very deep, you could see the bottoms. But that was before the genocide, and I don't take that word lightly. In fact, I studied Russian and German, and I know what it means. This was a systematic extirpation of hardwood, topsoil, and fir that caused this level of degradation. This is a soil survey from Fairfield County, and this is where the soil type rough gullied land got invented. And I don't even know if you can see it because my screen is blocked by your faces, but it's over here on the far right side, and there's a little piece of it right there. This is a soil of the Anthropocene, and so is sessile clay loam. It was already understood that the sessile clay series was a precursor to rough gullied land. It was not soil really at all, it was subsoil. We think of the Piedmont is characterized by red soils, but those were all blanketed under topsoil, and historically you wouldn't have known that they were there. Meadow is another anthropogenic soil type. It's that fill, that alluvial fill that falls into valley bottoms and buried streams, again, between 4 and 13 feet deep, more behind mill dams. So, what happened at Minkum? Minkum and Kings Mountain both fall within a region that Trimble surveyed, where he estimated that 7.6 inches of soil went missing. And the first soil surveys demonstrate, Minkum on the top left is encircled in red, that in 1905 it was sessile clay. Now, rough gullied land hadn't been invented yet. In the bottom right, you see Kings Mountain, the approximate area where we surveyed those streams, and it still has sessile loam. So theoretically, in 1905, Minkum was already more degraded than Kings Mountain was. And this is Minkum today. You see that half of it is covered in rough gullied land. Another third of the parcel is severely eroded or classified as moderately eroded. 10% is meadow, which is that alluvial fill. Actually, meadow has been further euphemized to riverview. So that only leaves about 10% that's still covered in sand or sandy loam. The first parcels I could find were from the year 1784, and there were already landowners annotated on the edges that had adjacent properties. And the North Pacolet region describes an area between, let's see, the Broad River, the Pacolet River, and the Spartanburg Railroad line. And it got its own column in the Weekly Union Times thanks to a man who goes by just the initial L. Minkum Creek was right here in between Thickety and Gilkey's Creek, and news from North Pacolet became its own column. So I had some really good newspaper articles to draw from as I was researching what happened at Minkum. And this is what L says, and I am paraphrasing a little, but he says that this portion of the county demonstrated North Pacolet once had the finest farming and most productive land of the county, but being traversed by several water courses, the principal of which are Thickety and Gilkey's Creeks, again, right on either side of Minkum, which isn't shown. It is very hilly and broken, except in a few small central elevations. Consequently, under cotton culture, and this is the year 1877, by the way, in case I failed to mention, it is now much worn and washed, yet it is claimed to possess more rich bottomlands to the area than almost any other section of the Piedmont region of South Carolina. A large percent of it is not in cultivation, or only nominally so, from neglect in keeping the channels of the streams clear of obstruction, like logs, for example. Since the close of the war, the corn crop has been of secondary consideration, cotton being the first, and the care necessary has not been bestowed in the drainage of these fine lands. This neglect is most conspicuous on Thickety and Gilkey's Creeks, on which streams from Thompson Mills to the shoals above. There are about 1,500 acres of the finest bottomlands, half of which is entirely swamped, the other nearly so, not producing more than 15,000 bushels of corn, when with good drainage, it would average 30 bushels per acre, making a difference in favor of drainage of 30,000 bushels, usually worth $1 per bushel. Quite an item in favor of drainage, and that is exactly what they did. They formed a drainage company and removed, let's see, all trash, brush, logs, trees, etc. This is right and just, they say. And then in this letter to the editor, somewhere further down along in that column, Keep the Streams Clear, this person from North Pacolet writes that you require me to clear the trash, brush, logs, and trees from my streams, but you do not say a word to me, although I send down into the same streams all the sand and dirt that I own and fill it so full that it ruins not only my land by washing it away, but ruins also all the lands below and above me on the same streams. So you can see that in the year, and this was from 1880, it had gotten worse than even what L had described. They start to write about worn out lands and worn out fields. They say it's been ruined, this land. The hills have been washed down into the branches, creeks, and rivers. And towards the conclusion of one of these articles, they write, as it took several years to run down a farm, so it will require several seasons to run it up. The process of restoration will necessarily be very slow. Now I will tell you about the trajectories, what is possible, how to move towards a place of intact systems and more pristine states, given the legacies and the course that they have set us on. There's a condition described called riparian hydrologic drought. And you can see that in a stream system like Kings, you have these shallow surface groundwater connections within the root zone, and you have these wide active floodplains bringing nutrients, seeds, and water to short-rooted plants. But in an incised stream, you'll have perhaps, that's hopefully, here it's halted by bedrock, but that's not necessarily the case. They can get quite large, as you saw evidence of before. You experience vertical disconnectivity. The water table sinks down to meet that gully. And the floodplain is in quotes because you can't really speak to having a floodplain at all. There's very little chance of a storm that could fill this channel up to overspill its banks. What I was interested to know is there evidence of riparian hydrologic drought when comparing the verdant riparian corridors of Kings Mountain to Minkum's piddly ferns? And I observed this, but I wanted to really see it and show it. And I used Robinson Design Engineers linear regression models to help me with demonstrating this. So here you have Emma Collins made this. It shows the channel depth of by how much water is, or how big of a watershed a given cross section has. So in red, and that red line describes where about Kings Mountain streams lie, drainage area and channel depth. And then in black, you see that many of Minkum streams are far above where we would expect to see them. And some of them do fall within that band of natural expected variation. But many of them are way too deep according to this analysis. So we also looked at top width impairment. Are these streams too wide? And in fact, we find a very neat fit of how wide a stream might be if we're using Kings Mountain to provide evidence of this. But Minkum streams, some of them are quite wide. And by the way, these are the smallest streams over here. So we have very wide top width on very small streams. And here's an example. In red, you see a cross section at Kings Mountain, and in black, one of a very close drainage area at Minkum Creek. And this is not entirely fair, but bear with me. The top widths are about the same, let's say. However, the depths are quite different. So does depth impairment affect riparian vegetation? If we think about it, if we were to draw an imaginary line, and there's no well data to confirm this, by the way, this is just theoretically, the water table at Minkum Creek is some 10 feet below where Kings lie, and 12 feet below the ground level, the forest floor, the floodplain floor. And during a 2-year storm event, Kings Mountain's stream would have this wonderful terraced floodplain area to buffer that flood flow, whereas at Minkum Creek, that flood is centered down in its base and could cause further degradation. What did the plants look like in these systems? Something akin to this. I saw predominantly Christmas ferns at Minkum Creek, and they were able to sort of cling to the cliff wall and live there. But at Kings Mountain, there was dog hubble everywhere. And it was a little unfair, the method that I used. I stuck a square frame on top and estimated percent cover of the leaves. And at Kings Mountain, there had just been a flood, and the dog hobble was defoliated in some areas. So really looking down at it with percentage, it looked less than what it was, and it had done some work for the stream in buffering that flood flow. They also had Christmas fern at Kings Mountain, those streams, and it was usually on the outside edge. And that ended up being sort of an interesting point as I discovered that it's common practice with forest clearing to stop at the fern line that should mark the outside edge of the riparian zone. At Minkum Creek, it seemed like the outside edge of the riparian zone was the only riparian zone. And I looked at that, how wide the riparian corridor width was, and then how dense, if you think of looking above it as a percentage, how dense they were with vegetation. And I wanted to know, did depth impairment lead to less dense and less wide riparian corridors? And I found out that it was statistically evident that yes, it did in both cases. With increased depth impairment at Minkum Creek, as in the closer you were to that Kings Mountain linear regression line, the more liable you were to have wider riparian corridors as compared to Kings Mountain streams. This is controlled by drainage area, so that larger rivers did across the board have larger riparian or wider riparian corridors. But if you control for drainage area, we still saw that depth impairment decreased the cover and the width of riparian zones. And then I also looked at something that's akin to top width, but it's a ratio, and it sort of predicts will this channel overspill its banks about every 2 years. And you just look at the physical parameters of the stream shape, and then look at some calculations about how much water flows in different storm events. And we find that indeed it did predict how wide the riparian corridor would be. It did not predict, or did not have an effect on how dense the vegetation would be, which kind of makes sense. The seeds, the nutrients, they get spilled over into the floodplain about once every 2 years, and it allows plants to colonize further and further on the outside edge of that riparian corridor. Now, as Joshua mentioned, I'm a beekeeper, so I care a lot about plants for ulterior motives. However, in this case, we are also interested in not only the biological function of the riparian corridor, but in its capacity to offer structural integrity to these streams. So if you can imagine, during a flood flow, not only is the above ground growth halting that, and this was in evidence because the leaves were pulled off of the plant. That's how fast the water was moving across that floodplain. But it's also holding the soil in place. And so you get these overhang banks that will not slump. They're stable. They're going to be fine. Which leads me to my next point. The Large Woody Debris Index takes the dead side of the plant life. It looks at dead log pieces and debris jams in streams or just touching the banks, and scores each individual piece. And then you tally those up and you understand how well a stream is doing based on the geomorphic influence of wood in it. And they look at things like orientation to stream flow. So they think about if a log is perpendicular to stream flow, it's going to have more of an influence on slowing down that water, so it will get a higher score. And then they also suggest that there could be 2 ways of assigning a functional category to streams. You can either do this, what Harmon calls a dimensionless range index, and this is just standardized by the length of stream that you surveyed, and I was able to do that one for both sites. Or you can use a ratio index, so that is to say that you would take Minkum scores and compare them to the highest scoring stream at Kings Mountain, and then you would see these fractions. So it sort of assumes that in a reference condition watershed versus Minkum Creek, say that Minkum Creek, you would only see about 30% or less of the stable wood in streams, and so on and so forth for functioning at risk and functioning. What I found, however, was that there was just one outlier, thank goodness. It allowed me to use the ratio index at Kings Mountain. So I was able to compare Minkum to Kings, but there was so much variation. And actually there was no, when I looked at a family-wise comparison, there was no statistical difference in the amount of stable wood or the scores that Minkum achieved versus Kings Mountain. And this surprised us a little bit because we were just assuming that with an older forest structure at Kings Mountain, you know, the youngest forest there, 80 years old, that there would be larger diameter trees dying natural deaths, that those riparian corridors would have an anchoring effect and lock wood in place. But actually I found that there was little difference between the 2 sites. And looking at that one outlier that I found at Kings Mountain, I don't know where the gully was specifically at Kings Mountain, but we do know that there were gullies. And we also know that the particular area of the watershed that I surveyed where I got that extremely high score is one of the youngest forests. And it was evident that it may also be experiencing depth impairment. So that led me to ask the question, do these functional categories actually match up with what's happening from a fluvial geomorphology perspective? And what I thought I would find is that the worst off streams would also correspond to a not functioning score. Streams that were somewhere in between would be functioning at risk. And then streams that were close to Kings Mountain would have a functioning or high score. And this is what we wanted to be able to demonstrate, to use this as a monitoring tool. We wanted to be able to use Large Woody Debris Index to identify not functioning streams and then intervene with engineered woody jams to demonstrate that functional uplift from not functioning to functioning at risk to functioning with the restoration approach that we chose. What we found, however, is that the trend was exactly opposite to what was expected. And so it's kind of worse than meaningless. It means the opposite of what it says. So this becomes quite misleading. Channels that experience higher depth impairment, that are super incised, get labeled as functioning. Channels that are closer to Kings Mountain, that are not so depth impaired, are allegedly not functioning. So if we were going to use this, we would be going in and intervening with engineered woody jams in the streams that need us the least. And I looked at this for top width impairment as well, and I found the same trend. And was it statistically significant? It was. Movement from not functioning to functioning meant a statistically significant relationship to increased depth impairment. And moving from functioning at risk to functioning meant a significant increase in top width impairment. So what's going on? If you think about it, it kind of makes sense. A stream with crumbling banks is toppling trees into it and will receive a higher score in the moment, even though this is helpful from a geomorphic perspective. It does slow the flow of water. That's exactly what Robinson Design Engineers intends to do, is slow that flow of water and get it on its path towards healthier stages. Kings Mountain has already healed. It's laterally active. And one really interesting thought that I had is that it's possible with the active floodplain that the large woody debris pieces are actually being stored in the riparian zone, carried off by floodwaters and deposited outside of the channel. And this is one of those intact systems that brings nutrients to the riparian corridor and makes them so lush in the first place. Will we use large woody debris index? I think not. However, I think it could be interesting to use in a few other scenarios, and it could be interesting for us to use to see how wood budgets change over time. It's not useful as from a regulatory perspective for this project, but it may be useful in a watershed that's suburbanized. If there's a lawn everywhere and no trees and there's no wood in the streams, then you're starting at a baseline of 0, and you could show progress over time as it reforests or as it becomes intervened with engineered woody jams. I also noticed that the large woody debris index had some redundancies, and I won't go over those, but the methods that are used could be looked over and improved on if the assumptions that there is not enough wood in the streams stands, then I think this method could be employed, but it should be tweaked. Lessons of the oldest inhabitant represent a kind of generational amnesia. Buffalo used to roam the southeastern Piedmont. We used to have grasslands, if you can imagine. We used to have wetland forest complexes, but no longer. I came across this phrase, the oldest inhabitant, reading these old newspapers, and I had the great fortune to Google search it, and I came across this hilarious article in Graham's Quarterly Illustrated Magazine from 1857, where the author describes who this figure is, the oldest inhabitant. He writes, "The oldest inhabitant of the present day was the young man of half a century ago. The young man of the present will be the oldest inhabitant in half a century to come. Every natural event is more remarkable now," so says the oldest inhabitant, than any he can remember. The next oldest inhabitant will say the same, and so on, from which it is to be logically deduced that in every successive year, natural phenomena are increasing in the splendor and vastness of all their attributes, that floods are getting deeper, hailstones bigger, lightning brighter, thunder louder, and summers and winters warmer or colder as the case may be. kind of strikes me as a little true. I don't want to play the oldest inhabitant, but I think the summers and winters are going to get warmer and colder, as the case may be. But we need to recognize our forgotten legacies before we start trying to plan for a future that's changing. We need course correction to understand what trajectory we're already on based on those legacies. And we need to prioritize intact systems, not just pristine forms. This is the definition of resilience. It's to be made stronger by disturbance. So taking those lessons of the forgotten legacies, how do we restore? It's not just about getting the streams right. It's about the missing soil and the missing forests. It's about the fact that in the 1930s, George Washington Carver was working with Henry Ford to make cars out of peanut shells. And if you can imagine how different the world would be, the reason why he was trying to come up with $1 billion idea for peanuts was because they're leguminous and they fix the soil. And he was in Tuskegee, Alabama, where there was crazy erosion happening. And he couldn't convince farmers not to plant cotton year after year. So what are we doing today that in generations people will forget about? What courses, what tweaks can we make today that will set us on a path towards resilience? It's not easy, and it's actually really complicated, but there's so many incised streams in the southeastern Piedmont. We can't quantify and prove every element of pristinity has been achieved. We have to just trust that resilient processes will take care of themselves. Thanks, committee.
I welcome folks to unmute themselves for at least some tradition in a thesis defense of law. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm happy to monitor the hand raising function, which you can see. If folks would like to ask Rebecca questions, we'll start with the general audience, and then the committee can ask subsequently. But please use the hand raise function in the or the chat. Both are excellent.
You know, I ran us out of time on purpose, so it's okay if you don't have questions.
Okay, I will go ahead and ask a general question before we close out the public component. So this large woody debris index was brought to the fore as a potential metric to help us get some quantitative measures. Do you know a bit about the history? Is there a particular region where this is more consistent with the functionality? I'm curious about the origin of this metric.
Yeah, it was developed by the Forest Service as part of their Wilderness Streams Ecosystem Monitoring Handbook. And in that application, it kind of makes sense because they're interested in scientifically in how these watersheds change over time, and probably as a response to timber harvest, which sort of calls the large woody debris index into question. You're going to get a lot of slash in those streams if you're harvesting wood. But if we're just looking at it from interest in over space and time in a wilderness area, then it could elucidate trends. However, the functional categories came later. That's part of the stream quantification tool, which is just a suite of monitoring procedures to draw from. And it's only been included in a peer-reviewed article once, as far as I could tell. And they found that the large woody debris index was not an interesting factor. It didn't correspond to anything else, that there were other parts of the stream quantification tool that provided more information of the degree of impairment than large woody debris index.
Thanks. Oh, I see Scott Harris is using the chat to raise his hand. Scott.
Yes, hi Rebecca. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed that. I've often enjoyed seeing the erosion, not really enjoyed, but you know what I mean from a geological standpoint. And I wanted to know if you saw any reference to the evolution of the Nick Point, the migration of that channel head. Were there rates that you came across and associated volumes through time, or was it just a general overall volume that you found?
No, that's a great idea though, and probably something. I mean, hopefully Minkum won't have Nick Points. So Nick Points being those, if you remember, I showed a picture of Chris Gross in the orange shirt standing at a head cut. Those create a little waterfall, so it's over steepened, and when it rains, the water comes crashing down and eats at the base, and it can tumble, and that Nick Point travels uphill and eats away at the hillside. And in some cases at Minkum, those head cuts end at logging roads that are already eroding. And so it's really concerning that they could unravel, that they could feed all of that sediment into the tributary system. I didn't come across any specific articles that talk about volume or rate. There was one article that talked about how quickly channels widen. And that was a really interesting one that I'll make a note to forward to you. But I think that's a really good point.
That would be great. And a second question is, we saw the same formation or the same channel formation out in Montana, and they don't have a lot of woody debris around. It's pretty much open grassland in the sort of the badlands. And that's a pretty interesting place. And when we go back out there in the future, it would be nice to tell the farmer some recommendation or provide some recommendation to them. Are you going to Montana now? Is that what you're scrolling for?
You know, I have a coworker in Montana. Maybe she can run by. I was going to show this picture. So Georgia is a new landscape, but like new in the sense of Anthropocene new. New Mexico is also a new landscape, but that's in geologic time. This kind of accelerated erosion wasn't endemic to the southeast Badlands in Montana. The first big demonstration area actually took place in Wisconsin, and that was thanks to the advocacy of Aldo Leopold. He shepherded that program, and there's some really incredible photographs of the erosion that happened in Wisconsin as well. So these legacies are all over, and so that's an interesting point, because the southern farmers, they certainly triggered the erosion with activities that they conducted, but they're not necessarily at fault. In a way, it's these sugar soils, it's the geologic context of where we live. The same cotton farming practices in the Northeast wouldn't have had the same effect. And another sort of strange tweak to that, where we shouldn't really call this land abuse. It was no heinous act. These aren't bad farmers, or this is that there's another point there. I'm going to remember it. Oh, I remember. In the Northeast, it's cold. If you have cattle, you have to build barns. You have to plant hay to feed your cattle over winter time. In the Southeast, you can just let them roam. You don't need barns. You can just follow that fertile footprint of the forest and live in its wake, and the cattle can roam free all year round. So there were just some other contextual constraints that were just common sense for farmers that led to some of these insane landscape features.
Cool. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for the question.
Are there any other questions from our audience? Well, without seeing any additional raised hands or any notes in the chat, join me in thanking Rebecca for a stimulating talk this morning. And
Thank you. Nice to see you.
And then now the committee will step into closed door session.